All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this month's BPAC meeting, and happy Bike Month. Speaking of Bike Month, a few other GNRC staff and I had a chance to participate in the Tour de Nash, put on by Walk Bike Nashville. It was a really great ride, and we got to see some of the Walk Bike staff as well, but I'll leave that update to Nora in our member updates section at the end. So same teams basics as previous meetings. Please keep yourself muted unless you want to speak or make a comment. Carson Cooper from GNRC will be managing the chat box. So in our various discussions today, you're welcome to put any thoughts or questions in there. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and start with the agenda. So I'll take a quick second to pause. If there are any BPAC members who haven't attended a BPAC meeting before or are new to our committee, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what organization you're with.
Sure, I guess I can start. I'm Adam Blair. I'm a consultant with EBP. We're a transportation planning and economics firm based in Boston, and I'm our Nashville office. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Adam. Good to have you here. Anybody else new to BPAC and want to introduce themselves? All right, well, I'll jump into the agenda. I'll give you a quick recap of our meeting back in March and some of the work we've done since. And then we've got Andy Barlow here from the city of Mount Juliet. He's going to give us a rundown of the recently completed Town Center Trail and sort of the project development process that was associated with that. Then we'll have a quick debrief on some of the safety events that have taken place over the past month or so, and have a discussion of some of the next steps we can take in our various roles in the BPAC. And then I'll give you an update on some of the active transportation counter selection updates on that program. And then we'll go through some next steps and some member updates. So back in March, which was the last time we officially met as a BPAC, we had Josh Green here from KCI tell us a little bit about the product development process of the Arthur Avenue cycle track in North Nashville. And he told us a lot about the community engagement portion from that, which I thought was a really great presentation. And then we had Ashley Hunter-Mason from TDOT give us a presentation on TDOT's Active Transportation Counts program and some of the steps we need to take as an MPO to make sure that we're ready for installation by the time TDOT procures counters. So I'll talk more about that later in this meeting. And then last month, we had our Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian workshop, which was a pretty successful workshop where VHB and FHWA touched on some countermeasure design and some of the national, state, and regional pedestrian safety trends. But without further ado, I will hand it off to Andy. Andy, whenever you're ready, you can just tell me when to advance the slides, and you can go ahead.
Certainly. Thanks, Daniel. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks, everybody. Pleasure to be here with you all. So, first time here with the GNRC BPAC. Have been a participant of the Mount Juliet BPAC for several years. Either I or my staff have been. So, talk about a project today that actually began well before I came to the city. I came to the city in 2014 in my current capacity as Director of Public Works and Engineering. When I came on, Deputy Director, more or less overseeing the transportation projects for City of Mount Juliet. And around that time frame, actually we made another hire, Matt White, as our transportation project manager then, and now is Deputy Director of this department. So I've you know, as I go through this project and the presentation here, I have to extend a huge thank you to Matt for overseeing that through construction for this project. So thank you all, everybody, as well, for having me here. Go to the next slide. So the project we'll talk about today is the Town Center Trail. Now, this, of course, in Mount Juliet, as sort of the nomenclature of the project is, it is in the center of town, more or less a east-west type roadway, greenway along the West Division Street corridor. Also along, which follows closely with the R.J. Corman, which was formerly Nashville and Eastern Railroad. So this project, multiple phases thus far, and future phases as well. So this project was first conceived in 2003 in the city's first ever bike ped and greenway plan. Generally east-west type alignment, following either along the roadway or the railroad, either one. We did have phase one, begins on western terminus at 4th Avenue and then ends at the Star Station for Mount Juliet, which is just east of Mount Juliet Road. We'll get to the overall map here in a second. Just give you a little bit of the stats here. So that project was an ERA project, which was the stimulus projects about 11, 12 years ago. That was constructed, probably completed almost, maybe a little over 10 years ago. It was around 2,300 linear feet. It was a good first phase, but it does have some limitations to it. Roadway adjacent, maybe not quite as inviting for maybe some novice users. It is 8 foot in width, which is the older standard minimum width. So it does have some limitations there, but it was constructed with phase two in mind. Phase two has been recently completed in 2020. That is what we are going to be looking at a little more closely today. That project actually began phase two when I was here. When I got here to the city, we had just recently gone through a bid award time frame and had some bids. There was phase two and phase three. Phase two bids came in very high. We received some additional CMAQ money at that time. They expanded the length of the scope to what got constructed, and I'll actually enhance a lot more connectivity options, I'll say, to a larger project. So we went through, so it was bid 2013, I believe, and again, we bid it twice this past time. Had some difficulties there, which I'll get to in a little bit, but happy to say recently been completed. With the next slide, we can take a look at the overall map. That kind of gives you an idea of where this is at. What good are we talking about this without a map to orient ourselves? So to bring everybody up to where we're at on the site, highlight some areas here. Phase one, you see in yellow. Phase two, sort of in the, I guess, reddish color. So phase two originally was going to end at Brookstone subdivision there, where they connect, sort of in the center of the image there, and that got expanded much further on to the west, so to South Greenhill Road. So, give you an idea where exactly this is located. Mount Juliet Road is to the east, right there about where the phase one ends. Phase one actually went across the roadway, did provide a connection. You can see this is a little bit of an older overall map, still has the Nashville star, so it's just a star now. But the platform there. So we do have direct connectivity to the Star Station itself. So very unique, I think. And one of the big points we want to highlight here is that this does have connectivity for transit, rail transit in the Metro Nashville area, which is extremely unique. And so that's one of the things that I feel like is the next phase for this. We can kind of talk a little bit more later on, maybe in some Q&A time, as far as visions for what we see with a lot of our bike ped infrastructure, what it is today, what it can be in the future. But the idea is here that we do have that as a major connection point. I do want to highlight as well neighborhoods. So we're not far from having neighborhoods here connected directly to a transit stop with full, safe access to the transit stop. Center of the page, you have Brookstone, that's on the south side of Division Street. There is some challenges there. There is no crossing there today. We do have another project. We'll be providing at least a crosswalk and a crossing across Division Street. But again, some connectivity to Brookstone remains. More to the west, northwest of the page, have Willoughby Station. Connected to that is another neighborhood, Hickory Hills. Those two combined, I think, are about 11 or 1,200 homes. Mount Vernon Estates, I believe, is more in the 200, 250 range, maybe. But you have a lot of neighborhoods with good connection opportunities with this project. Not there yet, but opportunities. And so this is, you know, obviously as well, I think we did mention Division Street, so West Division Street is there. West Division, sometimes referred to as Old Railroad Bed Road, which it was originally a railroad, which means the railroad is close by. So we do have a single track there for Nashville and Eastern, or R.J. Corman, which is north of the roadway alignment itself. So hopefully that gets everybody oriented kind of where we're at here. The next slide, we can talk about the sort of the basics of what we have. I think the overall map, it said 1.7. Ultimately, it came out to be right at 1.8. I like to round up. So 1.8 miles in total length for the phase 2. So a pretty good sized project for a singular phase, especially when you're dealing with grant funds. So as I mentioned earlier, we did bid that 3 times over the course of 6 years. Final construction cost on that came out to be $2.6 million, a little bit over that. The idea of the trail was more off-alignment, off-road alignment, small sections where it's road adjacent, but by and large, primarily off the alignment. So it is an asphalt 10-foot wide, multi-use path. And on this one, we did have several challenges with a lot of boardwalk sections as it was originally designed. That was a challenge as far as value engineering, trying to get that designed correctly. We'll get a little bit to that in just a second, but along with that, there were 2 at-grade railroad crossings that had to be done as well. The next slide, you can see a good example of an up-close shot of one of our boardwalk sections that we had, basically, which is wet weather conveyance going underneath it, water flowing to the right of the page toward East Division, or West Division, I'm sorry, on the right-hand side. Also, right there, you see the railroad tracks as well. So, kind of in the foreground is Tate Lane, county road, but city road right here, but primarily a county road. Interestingly enough, I think I want to highlight this. Within the last 6 months, the city has began in earnest acquiring more land for city parks. The land just to the north of the railroad right-of-way here was purchased by the city for the purpose of sports fields. And so we expect that to be, it's in the budget, should be constructed within the next year or so. What is exciting about that, it will have its own facilities as well. It will be connecting to this facility, and so we can talk about enhanced recreational opportunities with this greenway section. that's, I really expect, we have a lot of use out of it already. I really expect those uses to grow exponentially. But one thing I mentioned on that, as far as value engineering the boardwalk, we wanted to make sure from a cost perspective that we were designing it correctly. We wanted to be able to handle maybe some utility vehicles and things like that for repairs and such. We did get tested. The next slide would show we did have a drunk driver on the Greenway. So this was quite humorous. This picture says it all. No motor vehicles on the right-hand side, and yet we have a Hyundai on the boardwalk section. They would have made it around except for the bollard there in the middle. How they got on it, I'm not quite sure. Probably why the side's already dented up. But the boardwalks held up well, and so we know that at least we can drive some compact cars on the Greenway if we absolutely had to. So anyway, but talking a little bit more about the challenges, the next slide, we did have several on this one. I think as you go through the development process, sometimes we think, well, we want to build a multi-use path Greenway section, and sometimes things in concept really make a lot of sense, but in execution, especially with grant funds, you really have a lot of difficulties you have to overcome. A long time ago, before I even got to the city did enter into an agreement with Nashville and Eastern Railroad, which, interestingly enough, Nashville and Eastern Railroad Authority still owns the right-of-way. R.J. Corman is the operator, so not to make it confusing, but it's really confusing. We do have that agreement in place. We are primarily within the railroad right-of-way for the entire length of the project. One of the other big things that forced us on the north side of the tracks, actually added 2 crossings, were utilities being in the way. And so we had a big water line on the north side of the roadway. Sometimes you have utilities there. Those utilities may not think too highly of having something other than a roadway on top of their facilities. The risk for repair of that, if there was a utility there, would be on the city. So it was decided to go to the north side of the tracks for the majority of the alignment. Of course, with that, we still had utilities in the way. There was fiber optic was on the north side of the tracks, which I believe Sprint fiber optic, but oddly enough, Sprint's fiber optic was within CSX, has an easement for fiber. So we had CSX here as well, despite it not being a CSX alignment. So it was a challenge. Did mention the 2 railroad crossings. I will say, you get into design, and especially with federal aid, you have TDOT oversight there as well. There's some diverging interest in design. You talk about pedestrian safety. Particularly, we have one crossing at Cemetery Drive where it goes north of the tracks on the eastern side. There was a non-mountable curb that was constructed or designed. We went through the design, went through the approval process, through TDOT's oversight, and get into construction. And oh, by the way, this is a quiet zone as well. And so you have Federal Railroad Authority there involved. And so that posed some challenges. There were some concerns over having the non-mountable curb there and the ability for vehicles to escape. So where it was a private drive. It caused some challenges. Even up to last month, had a meeting with TDOT Railroad staff, not being too pleased with the way that it was designed, despite the fact it was approved that way. So There is still challenges, I believe, as far as multimodal type facilities, especially when you get to railroad crossings. Of course, safety is priority number one. We want that, but then when you're considering safety of the non-motorized public as well as the motorized public, sometimes that can create some challenges. I will say that on this, costs were a challenge. We're about to bid another greenway. We're anticipating some similar issues there as well. I mentioned the boardwalk earlier. That was one of the things that we did have to value engineer to try to get better costs. The two bids that we went through ended up having being able to value engineer based on time frame and the boardwalk cutting out about $1 million out of the bid itself. So another ironic thing, we did have some residents there that were within Mount Vernon Estate. We did have to do some tree clearing, which created quite a bit of rub from some of the residents with the in their supposedly, or that they thought was their backyards. But so as with anything, I think if you build a greenway, people will build homes next to it thinking it's a premium. But if people have homes there and then you go and build the greenway there, then you're a nuisance. Despite the fact those challenges, there's been overwhelmingly positive feedback on that. Go to the next slide. Take a good look at the overview of the finished product. This is our trailhead at 4th Avenue, so on the eastern end of Phase 2. You see 4th Avenue crossing there in the bottom right-hand side, railroad to the right, West Division to the left. One thing I do want to point out here, sort of in the center of the image, is a bike park that was constructed. That was actually an Eagle Park project, or Eagle Scout project to create this park. Hugely popular, so popular we had to build a gravel pad before we even had this project under construction. But it was built and designed about 2 years prior to the Greenway, and built around what we knew the alignment for the Greenway was going to be. So not only do we have a multimodal type facility here for recreational purposes, for transit, home to transit type purposes, hopefully as this grows, we also have some really good, nice features here that can help kids as they learn to ride bikes and learn the rules of the road as well. So it's really been wildly popular. We have that. It's hard to see, but there's actually a rock climbing feature as well. So you have all this packed into this little area here, and just the connectivity and the energy here has been really, really positive. And so, in this area, you can kind of see a little bit further. It's further on to the west as we look sort of toward the top there. A lot of the neighborhoods and everything like that. So, I was very, very proud of this project and how it turned out. Still, obviously, some landscaping and things like that I think is still remaining. That we're going to be working on some ourselves. But go to the next slide and kind of hit some of the little high-level type points here. So one of the things I did want to mention is that it was, when we talk about latent demand and what we expect from our facilities, whether it's recreational or home-to-work type stuff, we all knew here locally that this was going to be a signature project, not just with finished product, but because we knew it was going to be used. And fact of the matter is, they were barely finished grading it out without any stone whatsoever when people were using it. It was pretty amazing. So a lot of use even in construction. We did have formal ribbon cutting on it, but it was almost anticlimactic because of how much it was used before even that time. So, as a result, obviously overwhelmingly positive feedback. Probably, I would say the one complaint that we're having on it, and we knew this would be the case, is connectivity. And knowing that that's still hanging out there. So, talking about that, I'll hit the next slide. We've got some projects that we have planned. And I think the idea here is that the main spine is completed, but we still need those good, safe connections. I highlighted those neighborhoods earlier, but we've got to get connections to those. So one of the things that we've seen, I thought this could be the case, but it's definitely been real. We do have demands where people are parking in the grass. There's not enough parking spaces. We saw on previous slides some of the parking area, but in your high recreational times of day, there's not enough parking. So we actually, earlier this year, even expanded the westernmost parking lot. But how do we try to create that to where we don't have people driving to go on a greenway? We got to have that neighborhood connectivity. Neighborhoods I mentioned on the western side, I believe, are the bigger drivers of users. So one, we actually have South Greenhill Roundabout, which is on South Greenhill Road, just north of the western end of Phase 2. And we also have Town Center Trail, which is Phase 3, which is actually going to be extending this further to the west. We actually have Mount Juliet Elementary School further to the west. So we go to the next slide. We take a look at the South Greenhill Roundabout. So it's a roundabout project, right? So, well, the idea was we had a safety issue at this intersection of South Greenhill and Willoughby Station Boulevard. So with that, with complete streets in mind, we knew that we were close to the greenway itself. And with that, we said, okay, well, let's try to see what we can do about designing the roundabout with those connections at least in mind. We don't necessarily have to do them now, but we want to design it with that in mind. Well, as the project was going into development, we did have good political support on this to go ahead and at least create a connection from Willoughby Station, internal sidewalk network, to the roundabout and south to the greenway. And so that was step one. Additional, the irony of some of the complaints we had from Mount Vernon Estates residents was replaced with, there's no way for us to get to the greenway. And so with that, we actually have had some people who have fences along the greenway now have created gates in their fences to get directly to the greenway. There is no good public way to get from those internal streets to the greenway itself. So as an expanded scope of the project, we did extend this farther northward to the north side of the page, as you see on the exhibit here. That is to West Wilson Boulevard, which is Mount Vernon Estates neighborhood. So some future connectivity remains there. We did just want to try to limit our scope here, at least to the South Greenhill Road. It's a decently well-traveled facility. Safety is higher priority, obviously, on this roadway. Speeds here are a concern, which is why we're doing the roundabout. And so with that, we are, with this one project, we've taken a roundabout project, expanded it more into a complete streets type of project, and actually expanded the scope thus far to the place where it has, I would say, total cost of the project is, I don't know, quite 50-50 bike ped and roadway safety, but we're getting close. So see Sean had a question here. Do these neighborhoods have local greenways within or provided by the HOA? Answer to that, no, these do not. That is a policy that we make with every new development that does come in. They at least have their own internal walking paths, greenways, or in some cases public greenways that they have to construct as part of the system, but these do not. Not unfortunately, I wish they did. Go to the next slide. We'll take a look at the other, what I would probably say is one of my biggest pet peeves with the way that land development has happened traditionally, at least here in Wilson County. And I would say this is fairly common in the last, I'd say probably 30 years. You have schools that are constructed with absolutely zero connectivity to neighborhoods outside of traveling on a roadway. Mount Juliet Elementary School is the poster child, in my opinion, of a completely inaccessible school to area neighborhoods. And so what we knew is that with the Greenway in place, we knew what's the next phase. Obviously, we have to get down to Mount Juliet Elementary School. We've looked at trying to cross the railroad tracks. Grades are a major issue as far as we can't go under. We would have to do over, and so limited on open space within neighborhoods, it's really cost prohibitive. It's not out of the question in the future, but we knew what would be probably the most cost-effective connection is extending this greenway further to the west, another trailhead opposite of Mount Juliet Elementary School, with a good, safe crossing across West Division Street to the school. Now, in school times, they do have crossing guards there, so we know that that will be relied upon as well. So, in this area, we hit the next slide, kind of talk about the high points here. I talked about that home-to-school connection. One of the big things that we always see with roadway congestion in the area is around school times. Obviously, this year's been different, but in a typical year, the first week to 2 weeks of school, we get flooded with complaints about signals not being timed right, traffic congestion, had to wait 30 minutes for this, 45 minutes for that. It's all vehicles on a roadway with people taking their kids to school. And with that, how do we try to limit that? And it is providing those paths that a mom, a dad can walk a kid or a group of kids to school, or kids can go together if they're older elementary, riding bikes, walking together, and so you can create those carpools, so to say, of kids that are going along using this greenway that actually helps take some of that traffic off the roadways. I highlighted the area neighborhoods there. These are all within a mile of the school. These are all zoned for this school. And so this is hugely important to try to establish that connectivity. And we talked a little bit about the congestion there. So, kind of moving along, let's talk about some of the other projects in the area, some of the development type of stuff that I think is pretty exciting. We have Vintage Station North. That's a mixed use. It's actually TOD. So transit-oriented development. It's an apartment site with some commercial, at least. Red Bicycle just opened, for instance. There's some office space in there, some more commercial space on Mount Juliet Road yet to open. We do have Sellers Station, which is just north of East Division. It's actually adjacent to the railroad tracks as well. And we're seeing that. We're seeing some other smaller commercial development along West Division as well. We did have a city project as well as a clock tower, which had been envisioned probably several years before I got to the city. It took some time to try to see that vision come to fruition. And so sort of utilizing some of the area with the RTA site that's remaining, that's not within the parking area, to create some sort of a gathering spot. It's been used for, I know, the one-year memorial for the tornado when it came through. That was used as an area for there. Several different other type of areas. So you have that where this is a logical connection. You've got another route here that this can connect to. So in the next slide, we can get a nice view of Vintage Station. think what I want to highlight here, you can see a few things in here. Obviously, good dense development adjacent to the transit stop. One note on that is that I know the developers are pushing to get a platform on the north side of the tracks. So very excited about that. They have constructed connectivity to the system, to Mount Juliet Road, that goes around and connects to the station itself. RTA actually went through and expanded their parking lot, and as part of that, have also constructed connectivity to the trail as well. So we have much better connectivity to the station itself, which is on the right-hand side of the page there. Go to the next page, you can see a little bit, maybe a little bit broader. Or this is actually looking back from the station itself. So this is looking, you can see it across the tracks. Next slide shows a little bit of the clock tower itself. And as it is, a lot of things have come together to really enhance the corner. I'm a big fan of enhancements from an aesthetic standpoint that I think helps invite the desire to want to use these types of facilities. There's been some landscaping in front of this wall here that's been done since this picture. Some transportation or travel lane improvements done on Mount Juliet Road. I will say one of the things that I'm big on, yes, have your capacity for your roadway, but make sure that you're always addressing the pedestrian, bicycle type elements. With that project, we did have a crosswalk going across Mount Juliet Road. If you're going north to south, it was, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 160, 180 feet long. It's entirely too long. With that project, we're actually able to shorten that up probably to about maybe 70 or 80 feet. And so we reoriented our stop bar there and make sure that we're trying to create those the crossing that's much shorter and much safer. So very happy about that. Really starting to set the stage for this intersection, Mount Juliet Road and Division. I want it to be while it's a heavily traveled, I still want it to be a pedestrian-friendly environment. Part of that is enhancements. Part of that is making sure that our built environment, at least from our infrastructure, is there. So next slide shows a little bit. You can see the RTA parking lot, which was completed, substantially completed there. The roadway improvements weren't completed yet at this time. Neither was the landscaping in front of the clock tower, but that gives you a little bit different vantage point. Next slide shows the incredible Christmas place. So excited about that. A little bit unique for us in that it is more of a tourist type destination. Adjacent to this, they are planning some more museums type things. I know Dunkin' Donuts is going in as well, but a lot more office space in there as well. So creating not just connections for the Greenway for a train station, but beginning to set the stage for more of a true, vibrant town center that's walkable, that's accessible for everybody. And so excited about those types of things. I believe it's my take on the way that we enhance that type of use is really from the standpoint that create the facilities, create the connection points, create a lot. You're gonna immediately attract the recreational type users. Then let's get people who say, I want to go to the Christmas place. I want to hop on my bike with my kids, go to the Christmas place for an afternoon. So then you actually get some level of retail in there. And then you've also begun to start to set that stage. Well, I've ridden this before, then I can do this to go to the Star to commute downtown on mass transit rather than hopping in my bike. So it's creating that familiarity, which enhances the usability. And so excited about all those. That pretty much concludes it. Do want to give my last final quote that I always give. you're not in traffic, you are traffic. So if you find yourself in traffic, there's a way to get yourself out. Active transportation obviously is a major component of that. So I always give that out there as a reminder. Sometimes it doesn't make everybody happy, but it's a fact. So anyway, probably taking up enough time on that, but Daniel, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. I think one of the coolest things about that project is that it's so comprehensive. You really took all the problems that were in the area, and the congestion, safety, connectivity, connection to schools and retail, and really addressed all of those things at the same time. I think one question I'll start with, and then I'll allow anybody else to ask questions, is this kind of project isn't really all that common in our region. And I wondered if you had any advice, lessons learned from building this kind of project in a more suburban community for any of our other communities that are across the region that might want to do something similar to this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on suburban type areas, you think about it from an urban perspective. If you're in an urban environment, you may be confined to just the non-motorized options. You may not have a vehicle as an option. Suburban settings, a vehicle is always going to be the primary option. So how do you create that? To me, it's those origin and destinations. It's creating that type of, okay, we know we have residential, we know we have commercial. In our case, we have transit plus retail. And so how do you begin to create those even in smaller scales? That you've got to get people from their homes and get them familiar to taking this route to go to some commercial destination. And I think probably the biggest challenge with that from a suburban perspective, traditionally, we talk maybe like the last 50 years of suburban development, is it's not dense. There's no density to speak of. And so you talk about, I think that the downside of that is that it's going to create longer projects to get to your population centers. In our case, we've got probably a little over 2 miles, maybe 2.25 miles that we have here, and we're still not connected directly to a neighborhood. And so I think that's probably the greatest challenge of it. How do you try to identify those home to anywhere connections? What's your origin? What's your destination? You've got to have that. Recreation's great, but how do we get people that don't have to drive to go to a parking lot to walk or run or bike on a greenway?
Thanks, Andy. So we got a few questions in the chat box. Harry, I'll start with yours. Harry asks, when the traffic light at Oak Hall, Mount Juliet, will be installed?
Yeah, that's so we have that budgeted. That is, we're doing some analysis on that. We have a couple of signals that we're looking at. We do have one at Curd Road that we know is going to be in. The warrant is very strong there. The warrant at Oak Hall is moderate. And so we're doing some analysis to see, gap analysis to see with gaps, how and when is it warranted. We have it budgeted. We anticipate going with it. It's probably not, well, it's not going to be this year, more than likely probably next year.
Thanks, Andy. And then Sean Santaya from FHWA has got a question. It says, like you pointed out, there's really a ton of redevelopment and untapped potential at the Mount Juliet Road, Division Street intersection. Are there any other efforts by the city, land use or planning, et cetera, to continue to build on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did have there was an overlay, a town center overlay that was done, I'm going to say 2008 maybe, but that quickly became optional as the recession hit. And so with that, I know from a staff's perspective, we have Vintage Station North is a great example where, in a suburban setting, oftentimes apartments aren't necessarily well received. But our take on it from the staff perspective is basically saying, look, you are next to a transit station. It was formerly industrial zoned property and unutilized at the time the construction happens. So then you end up getting in good density. I wouldn't say it'd be a density of something maybe that you might see in more of a established transit area, but for the star line, good density that I would say is true TOD, especially for a suburban setting. Some of the other things that we've been looking at is traditionally here, it's been a push to parking in front, buildings in back. We're pushing more to saying, all right, maximize your lot coverage, pushing buildings up to the minimum setbacks. The Christmas Place is a great example of where that's been executed. And Sean's right, there's a lot of great potential here. Mount Juliet does not have a traditional square. This is our town center. It's basically just a crossroads. And so, but there are other opportunities there. We had a gas station proposed at one corner. Do not like that use at all. I think it's a terrible use for that location. I can't necessarily give my opinions necessarily to an approval body, but I have said, why not more density here? Make more density. Let's create the town center. Let's create more opportunities here. Create this central zone for us, central development type zone. No hard and fast rules or codes on it. We did actually increase height here. Of course, suburban, our height restriction, I think, is 35. I think it was increased maybe to 50, I think. So that's one small incentive that was out there. So I know that's been done. I wish we would see more high density type proposals, but it's going to come in time, I feel.
There's a couple other questions in the chat that can kind of be combined, but Sean from FHWA was wondering about, are there any greenways within neighborhoods that are privately managed by their HOAs, and, some efforts to connect those? And expanding on that, can you speak to the current subdivision regulations on those internal sidewalks or cul-de-sacs and paths, or if there's any easements on main road frontages dealing with those subdivisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the big things when I came to the city, we were woefully lacking, I believe, in a lot of our complete street type facilities. Well, specifically more I'll say from a bike ped type perspective. And so we updated a lot of facilities, basically local streets within subdivisions that are not collector type roadways are all 5-foot facilities, both sides of the road. We did just have one side of the road. So both sides, anything that would even be a residential collector or anything up is all 6. But probably one of the bigger things that we did with our Greenway plan, if there is a development that has a portion that touches basically a portion of our Greenway plan, they actually have to build the portion of the Greenway plan that's within their boundary. Jackson Hills, which is Signature Homes development next to Mount Juliet High School, is a great example. They ended up building probably, I would say, over 2 miles of Greenway along Cedar Creek and along the TVA power line easement. And so that is one of our land use regulations that we did change, I'd say maybe 6 years ago, that has provided a huge benefit. I think a huge thing here is that the city cannot build all of this. We have to be reliant on developments doing a large portion of this as well. In fact, developers build more roads than cities do. So, because they're building all the residential roadways. Cities aren't really building a lot of new roadways. We're expanding existing. And so, with the same thought in there, every roadway that gets built, it's got a sidewalk, a multi-use path, bike lanes with it. And then you also have, even if it's not on our Greenway plan, we still do require some accessible, ADA accessible type multi-use type of path or greenway path within the development itself for recreational purposes.
Then we've got another question from Robert Johnson from TDOT. He says, I note your decision to choose to route via the railroad rather than utility. Could your route choice have been different if the railroad had been CSX rather than NER or RJ Corman?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would assume so. I've never worked with CSX for greenways or anything like that, so I don't know exactly what their policies would be, but Nashville and Eastern at the time being a short line railroad, now RJ Corman, but still short line railroad, there's a lot more flexibility that we find with the short line companies versus the national companies like CSX. Very well could have pushed the greenway up to the roadway right away, I would assume.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Andy before we move on?
Andy, that's just a very impressive project there. It's Robert Johnson now with TDOT. Talking about trailheads ending, and I know that a lot of the grants that TDOT gives away ask that the trailhead be a logical destination. And your choice of South Greenhill Road, did you have any difficulties or problems with staging the project to finish at South Greenhill Road rather than going all the way through to Mount Juliet Elementary?
Yeah, I'll say this, that the limits were expanded right before I got here on staff. I will say that the original phase 2 ended across from Brookstone subdivision, and there was a small trailhead there, small being, I would say, 4 or 5 parking spaces. We did have issues as far as there was a design there to connect it across West Division, but without connectivity to any facilities within Brookstone itself, basically we had no logical connectivity point there. And so I'm assuming when it was done, it was more based on the availability of grant funds and what that would cover than necessarily taking it all the way down to Mount Juliet Elementary. We have had the extension of Mount Juliet Elementary on our short list for grant applications for a while now. It's just trying to find the right match of grants funds to the project.
Cool, thank you.
All right, we've got one more question, and then I think we're going to move on for time's sake. Woman Henderson says, thank you for speaking to subdivision requirements. Can you speak to what is specifically required along the main road frontage?
I guess we're talking about just within subdivisions, correct?
That's correct. I apologize. Within your subdivision regulations, so you spoke to your sidewalk requirements, internal greenway easements, all great. You did not specifically speak to kind of cross access from the end of cul-de-sacs or kind of reserving a parcel that could provide access. So I'm thinking of the linkages to your main road frontage. Just from a policy perspective, internal to your subdivision regs, what do you require on that main road frontage or connections to it, please? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do require stubs to existing properties. I think one of the big things that we have pushed for is connectivity between land uses, subdivisions, open land that might be bordering a proposed subdivision. So we do require that. Even if we know that there might be a roadway extended, we still do require the cul-de-sac there. Sidewalk is going to be all the way around that. One thing I do want to hit on, I think, with our updated standards that we went with a standard 6-foot wide grass strip. That's standard citywide. The idea behind that, it allowed the sidewalks to stay up You don't have to ramp your sidewalks down. You can still have good, decently sloped ramps from the roadway to the sidewalk itself without creating a lot of breakover angle issues with lower vehicles, and also creates a really good furnishing zone. I think one of the big things that we wanted to look for is create that area, want users to feel safe, to try to increase the usage there. So did want to note that. To me, I feel like we looked at several cities, metro areas around metro as well on that, and settled on going with one standard width, no matter the roadway. So all of our ramps are the same.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to everyone for the great questions. All right, well, I'm gonna move on with the agenda. So over the past month or so, we've had two events focused on non-motorized safety, but also pedestrian safety specifically. Last month, we replaced our BPAC meeting with a 2-day workshop hosted by FHWA and VHB on their Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian program. We spent a lot of time talking about specific safety countermeasure solutions, which they call the Spectacular 7, mostly focused on crossing treatments. And we talked about the national, state, regional, and local pedestrian safety trends, and how safety is really a paramount issue for pedestrians on pretty much every level of government. And then we went into 2 case study examples in our region, Gallatin and Mount Juliet, which really provided us a look into pedestrian safety solutions in more suburban areas of our region. And then last week, Cumberland Region Tomorrow hosted a basically complete streets webinar, creating safer streets, focused really on pedestrian safety and non-motorized safety. And it had a pretty diverse group of panelists, 3 of our own BPAC members, Nora from Walk Bike, Bill McCord from City of Gallatin, and Councilwoman Henderson from Metro Nashville, as well as Robbie Hayes from HNTP, who I believe is the lead on the Sumner County Bike and Pedestrian Master Plan. And that webinar really looked at pedestrian safety from a lot of different angles, from a lot of different stakeholders, all with pretty much the same mission, which was to make streets safer. So a lot of the topics from that policy, funding, design, I think we can carry over into a discussion. So between those 2 events, I think these are the 4 common themes that we noticed as staff internally, and I hope that all of you noticed as well. So really one of the main issues was safety. So on all levels of geography, pedestrian fatalities are increasing. Regionally, they've been increased every year since 2015, with Metro Nashville having the most on record in 2020. And then the backlog of infrastructure needs. So Councilwoman Henderson, you talked about this a lot. The sidewalks and crossing infrastructure were and have been neglected, as most of our roads were designed for cars. And because of that, it's more expensive to retrofit on the back end. We heard from Aaron Halfkinshield from Vanderbilt that it would cost around $10 billion to build 1,900 miles of missing sidewalks in Nashville alone, according to Metro Nashville's walk and bike plan from a few years ago. And then we heard that, and Andy actually touched on this in his presentation as well, some of the competing priorities between pedestrians and motorized users and land development. Our region has a multitude of other transportation problems aside from pedestrian safety, congestion, climate change, system maintenance. So as our region grows and develops, we've been prioritizing cars in our projects with road widenings, new roads, without really incorporating the proper safe walking infrastructure, which has resulted in increasingly unsafe walking environments. And then finally, from an implementation standpoint, We've had a lot of great plans with great frameworks from some of our local governments and the region and state, but we haven't had enough action or policy change or implementation to sort of carry some of those goals and objectives into actual projects and implementation. So before we start, I wanted to recognize the work that everyone in this meeting and anyone doing pedestrian safety work has done for really the past 10 years and farther. I've only been at this for a year and a half, and although I am a Nashville native, hearing the panelists speak about how far we've come made me a little more hopeful for how we can continue to solve this problem going forward. So I really want to treat today as a brainstorm discussion to focus our efforts. We've spent a lot of time in previous meetings talking about pedestrian safety. We've done a lot of data analysis, and we know quite a lot now. We know where our problem areas are, but we also know that fatalities are increasing. So figuring out how we can move forward and what we can do better. So I'll start with the first question: where should we focus our efforts to prevent pedestrian fatalities and improve pedestrian safety? So if any of the panelists from the webinar or anyone else in the BPAC wants to start with an answer to that question, feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat.
I guess, Daniel, I'll start just to get things going. This is Councilwoman Henderson. I think you spoke to this just now as to the data that we have and the analysis that's being done. I think, among my colleagues, when we think about priorities internal to Davidson County, I think we feel it's incumbent upon us to make our existing facilities that are unsafe kind of safe first. Obviously, we need to be building new infrastructure, but making connections to schools and places we can shop and places that we're already seeing danger. That I think that comes first, and there's so much of that. I think I'm always mindful as we share that most of our fatalities in Davidson County, Nora I think knows this statistic better than I, but somewhere in the 80% range are on our state routes. And so, when we get down to the implementation discussion question, I think really the elephant in the room is always funding. We've got a lot of great plans and a lot of great programs and a lot of good people working on this, but there's simply insufficient funds to deliver what we need to do because we're 80 plus years behind on all this. So I'll just say that to maybe get things going. Thanks.
And this is Rochelle. Insufficient funds for sure, but also just restrictions with the funding that is available. I really believe we need to be doing more to build projects quickly, where we know that we're having problems with pedestrians being hit and killed. So releasing more funds more quickly to do these quick build projects that are proven. Any of the FHWA step countermeasures, 5 of 7 of them can be done fairly quickly. Rapid beacons and crosswalks, right? That's what I would like to see happen.
Rochelle, I've got a follow-up question from that. I think that's a really good point. Do you think, what are sort of some example strategies of how you think that could be accomplished? Is it a quick build program from either a local or state level, or is it more safety guidelines on existing programmatic investments? What does that look like to you?
I think both of them would help. Safety guidelines while we're implementing projects, but yes, a state and local programs for quick build pedestrian safety programs. We don't have that in place. So that's what I'm suggesting.
This is Nora. at Walkback Nashville. I would also add, I think we need to be thinking about both the short and long-term solutions from a corridor perspective. I think historically we've kind of focused on like one crosswalk or one, spot here, one spot there. And so some people like to joke, we have one of everything in Nashville. Like there's one crosswalk somewhere on the corridor. So I think really starting to look at entire corridors. So for Murfreesboro, we might need 20 crosswalks. And so can we do a quick build program that kind of gets a whole bunch of them in at once? And I think that'll also make them more effective. I know the one on Nolensville has struggled because there's the one at Casa Safran because it's the only one on the street. And so it kind of feels like it comes out of nowhere. So I think, starting to think less about this one crosswalk and more about for this stretch, how do we make sure there's kind of continuous safety along this entire stretch?
Definitely. And the like rapid flashing beacons and pedestrian hybrid beacons are more effective when there are more of them in cities, for sure. So like those specifically, like in addition to the corridor approach, like the more people are seeing these things, the more effective they are, according to the research.
This is Sean with GNRC. For following up on Rochelle and Nora's comment, do you guys think that there's a more like a certain level of government is most suitable for this type of quick build programmatic investment?
Yeah, I mean, I realize we're talking about it at a regional agency, which may be the place where it is hardest to come up with such a thing. So, yeah, either local, state.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would make sense for the local government to lead, especially as Nashville hopefully gets more capacity at a DOT. But it's going to require pretty close cooperation and approval from the state. So I think it has to be kind of both agencies. And I think just kind of related to that, one of the main things is I think both agencies need to be more comfortable with understanding that the goal should be controlling vehicle speeds to safe speeds. And so I think that's just something that particularly TDOT is not yet comfortable, facing the fact that Nolensville Pike maybe should have a design speed of 30 miles an hour near the business districts.
Yes, it's Robert Johnson. I'd definitely agree with all of those comments. Certainly, I think another mind shift that perhaps needs to take place is that we need to be spending money on quick fixes, and I think sometimes there's a conflict between a quick fix. We need to get this on the ground now because people are dying and being seriously injured. And people who are like, we've got to plan this properly and it should be a large and comprehensive project that makes a real difference. And actually, maybe those are not both conflicting goals. Maybe we should be expecting to do staged implementation or quick projects now that lead on to more permanent solutions. And before we throw up our hands and say, that means that phase one money was wasted, perhaps we need to look at it in terms of, yes, but let's look at the lives that were saved by that intermediate phase, which could be done quicker and cheaper. And if it saves half a life or it saved 10 serious injuries, that's still adding up to a lot of pain and suffering that's avoided before we then moved on to a larger, more expensive, more comprehensive solution. And I don't feel like the idea of spending money on phases, which are then superseded only 1 year or only 3 years later, I don't think that level of thinking is kind of struck yet. And I think that's a possible solution to every comment that's just been made.
This is Bill McCord over in Gallatin. I'd like to mention, at least as it relates to safety, one thing that's sometimes often overlooked is the focusing too much on design and the facility itself, where there needs to be consistent programs, both at the Department of Motor Vehicles as well as our school system, to teach people about the needs of pedestrians and bicyclists and their rights to use the right-of-way and the roadways. And sometimes that gets lost in the more sexy things of providing a new facility. So we don't want to let up on that. I know the Safe Routes to School program is kind of merged in with other things now, and the focus on participating in the school environment to teach them, particularly when they're young, is somewhat fleeting.
Bill, I think that's a great point. One of my follow-up questions to that is there something we can learn from the existing programs that we have? Like, do we need to bolster our existing programs and provide more funding to them, or do we need new programs with additional funding that better serve sort of the safety issues that we're dealing with?
I'm not sure if it would be some kind of coordinated effort between personnel from TDOT and the school systems to develop a program that is consistently provided to particularly the younger kids in elementary school age, and maybe even with bike rodeos and that type of thing as well at that age. By junior high school or middle school, it's a little tougher to get to the kids. And sometimes with like the bike to school programs and things of that sort are helpful. Safe Routes to School, sometimes you develop a project like that and you focus it on a particular school that needs some assistance, and those kids are graduating high school at the time that facility is being built, so it's kind of lost on them in many cases. So it's just like most things that we deal with. You got to hit them hard and you hit them often.
And Bill, this is Councilwoman Henderson. I would say on the education front, I have teenagers, recently gone through driver training. I would say at the state level, I think our driver training is somewhat lacking for an understanding that, speeding kills, and that, the reduction in speed matters, and just kind of, I don't really think our 3-foot law is sufficient, because it's hard to judge 3 feet when you're driving a, massive Ford 150 or Suburban. And I think, we obviously need to design better facilities and retrofit them so that people don't speed. But where we are right now is we have a bunch of roads designed for speed and throughput. And I don't think, given the current status, we're doing enough on the education front for, teenagers, and as well as, adults. Many of my constituents who are asking me for speeding enforcement, in fact, are the ones themselves speeding often. So there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance in, parents asking for speeding enforcement in an effort to rightly, help their neighborhood streets be safer for their kids to bike to friends' houses and so forth. But then, getting in the big vehicle and, speeding on their way to take their kids to school. So I think, some of that kind of community accountability and education, and I know some of our nonprofits have done some of that work, but I think kind of across the board and at the state level, elevating that education would be money well spent and time well spent.
Councilwoman Henderson, I really appreciate that point. I think part of what you said goes back to something you said in the webinar, because you mentioned enforcement and policy and also like education campaigns, which are all super important to improving safety. But with Metro Nashville about to embark on or I guess they already started on a Vision Zero plan and also an update to the walk and bike plan. Do you think that a new plan should include all of those things to have a more comprehensive look on how we should tackle pedestrian safety, or do you think that there's one of those, maybe policy or maybe enforcement, that is more important, and we should prioritize focusing our efforts on that?
I think it's both. I personally would like to see more automated speeding enforcement because it's unbiased. I know we have some issues kind of at the state level around that, and Nashville has been very kind of deeply involved in discussions about LPRs and not really segueing that necessarily to automated speeding enforcement. But I think, we do a lot of things that, solar powered, here's what your speed is, flashing, and I have constituents ask for those all the time and ask for signs. And, to my understanding and experience, it's, the conscientious people will let off the gas when they see their speed flashing. But if you don't have any consequence to that, it's not very effective. And so, I think every locality has to do kind of their kind of custom community responsive education efforts. But I do think at the state level, some sort of ownership of, the real danger. I mean, I say to parents often, the most dangerous thing you'll do today with your kids is, driving them here or there. And I don't think there's a real kind of awareness about that. The quotation from the gentleman who presented at the start, you're not in traffic, you are traffic. And so, we as drivers are part of the system, and slowing down, I think, is, I just try to repeat that over and over and over with my constituency. And it's helpful if others do the same, right? So I'm just not the nagging safe mom council member, safe streets kind of person. Having concerted voices about that at all levels of government, I think, is very important. So I think, any strategic plan, master plan around Vision Zero should absolutely have that education piece, but we really got to hit it at all levels to be effective.
Thank you, Councilwoman Henderson. I think one topic we haven't touched on much in this conversation is the retrofitting topic. I think retrofitting is a tall task, and really the question is, how do we retrofit effectively, and how do we make sure that we have policies and dedicated funding to address that? Because even if we have policies that require sidewalks on new developments and new roads, how are we ensuring that the existing safety issues on our pikes and our corridors, as Nora mentioned, how can we better retrofit those roads and have a more comprehensive approach at safety for those corridors? So if anyone wants to take a stab at that question.
I just feel like we're a very, very long way away from understanding induced traffic, and the idea that we're going to have to constrain motor vehicles, and retrofitting is generally going to involve taking away space and therefore capacity from motor vehicles. And we're just a very, very long way from understanding that.
Yeah, and I'm excited that we're going to be able to do a Dickerson Pike pedestrian safety study this fall and next year at Walkback Nashville in partnership with the city. And I think that'll be interesting to kind of dive into what retrofitting options are available, and maybe for the short term, but also maybe having a medium term where we start to look at curb cut consolidation, you know, even medians with temporary curbing, or even just with painted medians on those pikes. I think there are things that can be done that, you know, there's the most temporary, and then there's, I think, some medium phase stuff that doesn't require totally tearing up the street and adding sidewalks and redoing the curb and gutter and all of that. And I think for some of the pikes, Dickerson and Murfreesboro, that will be a space that's going to be really interesting to think about what can be done.
Thank you, Nora. So we've only got 7 minutes left, and this discussion doesn't have to end here. We can continue this discussion going forward, especially figuring out how we can work together as a BPAC to decide on maybe some action that we can take or some program that we can start pushing for, because what we're doing now isn't working as well as we want it to. So thank you all for a great discussion, and I'll keep moving on. So we don't have enough time to engage on a full discussion of the counter locations. So staff put together a list of potential counter locations using our own criteria, but also some of the examples that you all provided in the map that we sent out. So in a follow-up email to this meeting, I'll send out a link to a map that you all can look at, and that map tells you the city and the county that the counter could be placed in, as well as why we chose the location and the post, so whether it's a utility pole or a sign that the counter would be placed on. So I'll send out an email with that, but we'd like your feedback to look at each counter location and tell us if you think they make sense, so that we can then submit them to TDOT and move forward with this process. But I'll include more about that in my email, but I'm going to go to member updates real quick. So I'll start, and then I'll hand it off to anyone else that has an update. I'll give a quick update on the COVID relief funds that we've talked about in some of our previous meetings. This is just a reminder that the COVID relief funding that we're talking about is the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, which people have been referring to as the CRISA funding. So the purpose of this funding is to provide funding to address COVID-19 impacts. Traditionally, it's a 80-20 split for federal funding, but there's a possibility to not have a federal match required in this funding. And the eligibility is pretty similar to the STBG funding. This is the funding availability across all levels of government. Nationally, there's about $10 billion available, with about $210 million available at the state level, and $22.4 million at the MPO level. And then for our MPO region, we have about $8 million available. Our Transportation Coordinating Committee and Policy Board voted that these are the types of projects that are the highest priority. So good news for BPAC folks and us. I won't go through all of these examples, but roadway safety improvements, so some non-motorized facilities and traffic calming, ITS improvements and transit fleet modernization, sidewalk connectivity and pedestrian safety improvements, and then any ADA related improvements like sidewalk repair and curb ramp improvements. Our thoughts on the outline for the application were that we're going to recommend a formal application and pre-application process. So pretty similar to our other calls for projects, but project description and background, purpose, any past work that's been done on the project schedule, which is particularly important given that the obligation deadline for these funds is 2024. But we'll come back with a more fleshed out application form next month. We're looking to kick this off next month with a call for projects, then take a look at some of the submittals during the pre-application period, and then move into the evaluation in July and into the formal application period, with awards being announced in September of this year. We'll provide some more information going forward on our active transportation program as well, so look for that. But for now, we're going to focus on this COVID relief funding given the obligation deadline. Does anybody have any questions before I hand it off? Before I continue with some of the updates? Oh, sorry, I saw Rochelle's question. Yes, the map will include proposed locations, so there are going to be, we'll have access to between 12 and 15 counters for the region, and so we went with 15. The pin map, I think, had like over 30, and so the one that will be sent out to you all will have 15 potential locations for counters spread out throughout the region. So not just in Davidson County, but in all the other 7 counties that are Middle Tennessee. A few more updates. The Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, the RAISE grant, FHWA released information on this new program back in April. It was formerly known as the Build and Tiger grant. So there's about $1 billion available nationwide, but no more than $100 million to a single state. I think what's interesting about this and what's exciting about this this grant opportunity is that some of the objectives are to improve racial equity, reduce impacts of climate change, and create good paying jobs. And so the deadline for that is Monday, July 12th. And then finally, TDOT's upcoming CMAQ grant program. This is the round of 2021 applications. Backped projects are eligible, and as usual, the match is up to 20%. This is the timeline provided by TDOT. The letter of intent is May 24th to June 4th, the full proposal June 8th to July 9th, the review period July 12th to August 12th, and awards will begin in September or October of 2021. I'm going to quickly read Nora's update. Walk Back Nashville update. We had the largest tour de Nash ever last weekend. 1,350 riders. That is awesome. We're starting Dickerson Pike Pedestrian Safety Study in July, and Open Streets Nashville will be returning to Buchanan Street this fall. Does anybody else have any updates before we adjourn today?
Yes, if I can just jump in, because I'm gonna have to leave in a few seconds. But yes, the Multimodal Access Grant, a statewide competitive grant process for active transport improvements. We are very, very much hoping to announce that next week. So that's a little bit more than 20 projects probably are going to win that, taking $18 million for this year's round. So yeah, we're hoping to get the all clear to announce that next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That's great to hear. I'll probably reach out for you for some more information on that so I can send it to BPAC as well. Anybody else with any updates? All right, well, Andy, again, thank you for your presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending today and for the great discussion. Expect some follow-ups by next week with the meeting recording, as well as some notes and slides. All right, well, thank you so much to everybody, and have a great Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you all.